Today we're going to talk about the economics of the American West, new opportunities, new industries, new technologies, and ultimately new struggles. The first business that we're going to talk about in the American West is cattle, and during the Civil War, beef prices in the United States soared to an all-time high, and the American frontier was ideal for cattle herding. The American frontier was ideal for cattle grazing due to the abundance of grasslands and open areas. Cowboys would go on cattle drives where they would take a herd and move it through the plains to a large city, a railroad station, or to a slaughterhouse. This map here shows the main cattle drive trails in the United States. They are shown on the map in the red lines. Most of the trails intersect with the railroad or they end up in a large city. Also visible on this map is the abundance of grasslands that can be used for cattle, which is shown here by the yellow shaded areas of the map. The legend of the American cowboy was born during these time of cattle drives. The cowboy had learned skills like roping and riding from the Mexican vaqueros, but being in this line of work was physically demanding as well as dangerous. Cowboys usually worked a 14-hour day that included a lot of physical work or time in the saddle. The cattle drives consisted of cowboys moving a herd of 200 to 300 cattle through the often dangerous Great Plains. During this time, the cowboys were in the saddle all day, and they slept on the ground after a hard day's work. Cowboys were also at risk of running into severe weather. A thunderclap along the Great Plains or any other loud noise or sudden movement could lead to a cowboy's greatest fear, a stampede. Stampedes occurred when the cattle got spooked and it triggers them to all run at one time. Stampedes were not only incredibly dangerous, but they were also an incredible huge waste of time due to having to round up the herd. As the years went on, the cattle frontier slowly closed up. Cattle owners had their cattle overgraze the land, as well as the few years of bad weather that got rid of some of the grasslands. The invention of barbed wire, which you can see pictured here in the background of the slide, forever transformed the open frontier. Instead of livestock being able to move freely along the frontier, the Great Plains were transformed into a series of ranches with clear boundary and fence lines marked with fences and barbed wire. The Great Plains became settled by farmers who had begun to move west due to the abundance of available land. Families left crowded cities on the East Coast to try their hands at farming on the Great Plains, and farming became a big business in America. The Homestead Act was an important piece of legislation that was used to lure settlers into the American West. The Homestead Act, which was signed by President Lincoln during the Civil War, gave out millions of acres of land in areas like Iowa and Nebraska. Many of the homesteaders were families such as the one pictured at the top of the slide, who were going to try and run a family farm on the Great Plains. To receive land as part of the Homestead Act, an individual only needed to pay a $10 registration fee and then race to the west to stake their claim to some land. Homesteaders could receive up to 160 acres of land and receive the title to it after just 5 years. Many of the people who also began to settle the Great Plains were the Exodusters. The Exodusters were African Americans who had moved out of the post-Reconstruction South to areas like Kansas. Life on the Great Plains was a difficult life. The Great Plains are exactly that, plain. There is a lack of trees and water that oftentimes is a huge change for settlers. New settlers were oftentimes surprised by the drastic changes in weather. The grasslands could be dry during the summer and brutally cold during the winter. On top of that, the Great Plains are a frequent location for tornadoes, which can destroy crops as well as houses. Prairie fires were also common during the Great Plains due to lightning strikes. If lightning started a fire on the Great Plains, the grass fire would burn through everything in its path, and remember that at this time there's no firefighters to go and put it out. Crops could also be at risk due to infestation from bugs such as grasshoppers or locusts, which would ravage farmers' crops. As new industries began to sprout out, new technologies also began to find their way into the American life, and they were responsible for leading and aiding in the development of the American West. The railroad aided many settlers due to cutting down travel time from east to west. In addition to helping settlers arrive to the west, the railroad also helped take raw resources from the western states to the eastern states, as well as allowed the farmers of the Great Plains to send food to city areas to be sold. The railroad really did link the economies from east to west. In the 10-year period prior to 1880, some nearly 40,000 miles of railroad were built, bringing the total network up to 93,267 miles in the United States. By 1880, every U.S. state and territory was provided with railway transportation. Railway development was also exerting a powerful influence upon immigration and agricultural industrial growth through the country. Here in the top slide, you can see the the last rail of the Transcontinental Railroad about to be laid. The Transcontinental Railroad connected the country like never before. Here you can see the Central and the Union Pacific Railways coming together at Promontory Point, Utah. The connecting of the country through railroads would also cut down the travel time of the country, but it would really, in particular, help boom the economy. It was a feat that was applauded by all Americans. As the years went by, more and more transcontinental railways were built to connect America. The Southern Pacific Railway, shown here at the bottom, also finally put the Gadsden Purchase land to good use. Agriculture also experienced a new wave of inventions that would also alter the daily life of the farmer. The McCormick Reaper, shown in the picture with the horses pulling the guy on the tractor-looking thing, was invented to help farmers cut and bushel wheat. The reaper would allow a single farmer to do the work previously done by 14 individuals. It helps save time as well as increase production. In the bottom right, you can see a John Deere plow. In 1837, John Deere created the first steel plow. The steel plow helped farmers work at a faster rate, and it was good for life in the Great Plains. The steel windmill, pictured in the bottom left, was also crucial for the farmers of the Great Plains. The steel windmill made agriculture possible on the Great Plains by allowing farmers to access the groundwater that was needed for irrigation and for their own survival. With the creation of all these new inventions, the wheat belt was created in Middle America. Wheat grew well on the Great Plains, and farmers profited off of it for some time. Here the wheat belt you can see shaded in green and shown on the map. Eventually, as farming kept growing, bonanza farms began to sprout up on the Great Plains. Bonanza farms were usually owned by railroad companies or private investors with lots of money. These farms operated on a very, very large scale, usually 15 to 20,000 acre farms, and they usually only produced one single crop. As farms grew bigger, more and more farmers took out large loans for land to try and keep up with their competitors. Eventually, the farmers found themselves in a struggling area of debt due to the amount of loans that they took out for land and equipment. The bonanza farms slowly started to fold into bankruptcy over the years. Farmers on the Great Plains began to experience a slew of problems that led to their demise and incredibly tough times on the Great Plains. During the Civil War, the United States had issued $500 million in paper money, which were known as greenbacks. You can see some of the greenbacks shown in the pictures on the right. Greenbacks could be used to purchase items, but it could not be exchanged for its value in gold or silver. After the Civil War, the government began to take out of circulation the greenbacks that it had produced, which in turn increased the value of money that was left in circulation, the dollars that were backed by gold and silver. The value of money follows a supply and demand cycle to establish value. If there's more money in circulation, it means that the supply is high, which means that more people have it, which means that there's a lower demand for it, and it makes the money worth less. We call this inflation. If the amount of money in circulation is low, however, then the demand for it increases, as does the value of those dollars. Farmers who had taken out large loans when there was a lot of money in circulation and the dollar was worth less now had to pay back those loans with dollars that are much harder to come by and which are worth more than they had actually borrowed. Basically what happened is they had increased the amount of debt for the farmers and made it much harder for them to pay back their loans. The railroads also gave farmers many problems. The railroads charged farmers high prices to transport their crops, much higher than they did to their industrial counterparts, like, say, shipping Rockefeller oil or Carnegie steel. The railroads also conspired to control the price of grain by working with grain brokers and merchants. Railroads could store grain in facilities like the picture at the top, and they could store this grain to drop the supply available to the people, and which would then raise the prices. However, they would do this after they had bought the grain from the farmers for a low price. Farmers struggled to keep their place in American society. They were just as important to the survival of the nation of everyone, but years of economic hardship, bad weather, and not having any political voice to help improve their situation had left the farmers feeling alienated and struggling in America. As farmers continued to struggle, they began to join together to try and find a way to improve their situation. Ultimately, they needed a political organization that would begin to look out for their rights. To try and help farmers organize, Oliver Hudson Kelley created an organization for the farmers that became known as the Grange. The Grange originally started out as an outlet to get farmers to discuss their problems. It soon became a way for farmers to combat the railroads as well as to control the prices of their crops. Grain members would form what were called cooperatives, which were groups of farmers who would try to control the price of crops such as grain. Together, these cooperatives would sit on their crops and sell them at the right time to basically increase the demand for their crops and therefore increase the prices. The Grange was seen as a labor union during this time, which was technically illegal in the United States. The Grange movement soon gave way to the Farmers Alliance. The Farmers Alliance was a group that organized gatherings to educate farmers about the unfair economic policies in America and how the farmers could improve their situation. The Farmers Alliance had a much more clear and distinct political agenda, one that would ultimately be adopted by the Populist Party, so we'll cover it in the slides to come. Many of the Farmers Alliances, especially those in the South, discriminated against African American membership, and remember that many African Americans are in agricultural work through things like sharecropping, as well as the exodusters that we had talked about settling Middle America earlier. Eventually, farmers knew that their situation would never improve if they did not find a way to solidify some political power. This in turn led to the rise of populism, or what became known as the People's Party or the Populist Party. The Populist Party was championed by their energetic and spirited candidates. The farmers needed the Populist Party to increase the political power of the farmers and to form a way to fight for some legislation for farmers' interests. Farmers were struggling, and they did not see any major political party, either the Republicans or the Democrats, that at this time were really looking out for their interests. In 1892, the Populists would run their own candidate for President of the United States. The Populists would run on a very specific political agenda that wanted federal ownership and regulation of the railroads, a graduated income tax, meaning that the more that you make per year, the more that you pay in taxes each year, direct election of senators. At this time, the senators were appointed by the state legislators, and ultimately an economic policy called bimetallism that we'll talk about on the next slide. If you can look in this map, you can very clearly see that the election of 1892 ran three candidates: a Democratic candidate who was Cleveland and ultimately your president and your winner, a Republican candidate, Harrison, and then Weaver, who was the People's candidate or the Populist candidate, who won 4 states, all of them agricultural states. By 1893, the United States economy was not in good shape. The farmers were in debt, the railroads had started to go bankrupt, and our gold supply had started to run down. As the gold supply and banks started to run down, more and more citizens started to cash in their paper money for gold, thinking that soon it would all be gone. The effect of the panic had made its way all the way to Wall Street, which caused the prices of stocks to drop and caused more economic problems in the United States. While the United States had faced economic hard times before, the Panic of 1893 caused our first depression in the United States and left 3 million people in the U.S. unemployed. The crisis wouldn't end until a private investor and banker, J.P. Morgan, bailed out the United States with a $60 million private loan to help the country out of economic hard times. With the nation's economy in shambles, a hot debate regarding America's monetary system arose. This led to the issue of bimetallism, which was heavily supported by the Populist Party. President Grover Cleveland, who was on his way out of office, was a gold bug, a popular term used for those who supported the gold standard, meaning that the United States dollars were to be backed by their value in gold. The gold standard would put less money in circulation, which would eventually cause deflation in the economy. The value of money would increase due to there being less of it in circulation, but the prices of goods should also fall, and fewer people will have access to money. Gold bugs were typically bankers and businessmen. The Populist Party and new politicians, such as William Jennings Bryan, were Silverites. Silverites favored bimetallism, meaning that the American dollars were backed by both gold and silver. Bimetallism would put more money into circulation, which would increase the prices of goods and give more people money. However, the value of the dollar is going to decrease. Silverites were typically farmers and laborers. At the Democratic Convention before the 1896 election, William Jennings Bryan gave a speech that has come to be known as the Cross of Gold speech. In his speech, he states, "We shall answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this cross of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Cartoonists took the chance to take shots of Bryan following the speech, as you can see in the cartoons in the background. If you notice the one on the left, you can see that both the crown of thorns as well as the cross of gold that Brian referenced are shown in the cartoon. Both of the symbols Brian referenced were biblical symbols connected to Jesus Christ. In doing so, many people thought that William Jennings Bryan thought of himself as the savior of the working class. While the Populists had some small successes in running their own candidate in 1892, they decided that by 1896 to get the political support they needed, they would need to throw their support behind one of the two major party candidates. Some of the Populist Party decided to back Democrat William Jennings Bryan, who was running against Republican William McKinley. Other Populists refused to support the Democrats due to their Southern stronghold and due to the fact that the Democrats were still associated with being the party responsible for the Civil War. During the campaign, Bryan had stuck to his guns with his free silver campaign and his support of bimetallism. In doing so, he alienated some of the key Democratic voters that he desperately needed in the North. Bryan's campaign was also grossly underfunded in comparison to McKinley's, who was backed by support of the Northern Gold Bugs, who were bankers and businessmen. In a very close vote, McKinley edged out Bryan. On this map, you can see McKinley and the states that he won are shaded in red, while Bryan's states are shaded in blue. If you notice that the map shows that the beliefs of the political parties held true to the economic interests of the states. For instance, McKinley, whose Republican Party had beliefs that were favored by rich industrialists and businessmen, carried the eastern states, which had grown to favor these types of industries. Bryan had victories in the agriculturally based states in the South and the Midwest. The loss that would happen would crush the populist movement, and it would never again gain steam or support in American politics moving forward.